Hello and welcome everyone. I think a few people are still joining, but we will get started. My name is Kate Glenister and I have the pleasure of working as the publisher on the upcoming new editions of Legal Studies for VCE here at Oxford University Press. Here being my living room currently, which I'm sure is the case for many of you as well. I'd like to begin this session by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people as the traditional owners of the land on which this session is being held, and pay my respects to Aboriginal elders past, present and emerging. I just wanted to pop in before I hand over to our wonderful authors, Lisa and Annie, to run this session, and say a really big thank you for your interest and enthusiasm in joining us here today online, especially in the midst of returning to full-time remote teaching this week. Despite these challenges, we've got around 100 of you in this session here today, which is wonderful. And of course, we'd much rather be doing it in person, but nevertheless, we're very grateful for the chance to offer some PD for you virtually today. I'll be back at the end of the session to talk a little bit more about the new editions of Legal Studies, what's new, what's staying from the previous editions. But in the meantime, please sit back, grab a coffee or a tea. If you're at home, even grab a glass of wine and enjoy what I'm sure is to be a really great discussion between two experts in the field of VCE Legal Studies, Lisa Philippin and Annie Wilson. So I'll hand over now to Lisa to introduce herself. Thanks, Lisa.
Hi, Kate. Thank you. That was a really lovely introduction. It's really nice to see everyone, even though it's remotely, or see at least you and Annie and the OUP team. I'm sorry that we couldn't do this session in a physical premise, which was what was initially planned, but we're adapting to what are changing circumstances every day. And I just wanted to acknowledge all the teachers who have joined and acknowledge the announcement yesterday, which I'm sure it just feels like another roller coaster ride for everyone. And really challenging circumstances, not only in the professional environment, but for the personal environment. Thanks, Kate, for mentioning the possible cameo by my children. One or more of them. I'm currently sitting in their playroom at the desk, and so there is a very likely chance that they will come along and want to play with a Barbie or two. So I'm currently on parental leave. I've got a little 6-week-old at home, and so I'm really enjoying the opportunity to connect with people through this webinar, even if it's through the chat. And it's really great to connect with the OUP team. They've been doing an amazing job with the new editions. And I'll pass on to Annie to introduce herself, and then I'll get started on the first portion of the slides.
Thanks, Lisa, and welcome everybody, and thanks again. As most of you know, but some might not, I teach at Camberwell Girls Grammar, and I'm also the VCE Legal Studies subject editor for the VCTA's publication of Compact, which is really enjoyable to do, and I hope most of you are aware of that as well. Look, it's certainly a time, it's an interesting time, and it is great that people have given up some time tonight to join us, especially given heading back to remote. But I think I just wanted to say a little word and just, like Lisa, say, well done to people for what we've done so far, and acknowledge the work and say, try to stay relaxed about it. I've spoken to a few people today and some students, and I think the very best thing we can do is stay relaxed and calm and be flexible with the students and, realise that we will get there. It's challenging, it's different, but there are so many resources around now. Thank goodness we're in the third year of our study design. We've got past papers, texts, we've got lots of resources. Now, and I sort of urge people to jump online to the textbook resources if you haven't already done so. Lisa's made some fantastic classroom lesson support, and there's, PowerPoints and revision notes and a whole range of things that people can use. So I think we just need to stay calm one day at a time, and we will get there. So welcome everyone, and I'll head back to Lisa to start the first slide.
Yeah, thanks for saying that, Annie. It's such a good thing to say, and in particular leaning on each other for support as well, not only in the resources space, but for the kind of let's keep on going with this as well. So it's really nice of you to say that. So just before we go on to sort of the main portion of the slides, which is the tips to managing exam success, or tips for exam success. What we thought we would do is just very briefly run through exam details and specifications. So looking at the agenda slide, we'll go through the exam details and specifications. We'll have a look at the adjusted study design, which is now available online, and we'll have a little bit of a brief chat about that and what Annie and I's views about that adjusted study design are. And then we'll move on to the main portion, which is some tips for exam success, some of which will be familiar to you and which you're probably already doing, but some other ideas that we sort of generated as part of this webinar, what you're all familiar with by now. And look, who knows whether this will stay the same, but probably will in terms of when the exam is. It's currently set for the 23rd of November, which is a little bit later than when it normally is. It's still in the afternoon. And we all know what the format is. Like Annie said, we're in the third year now. It's not unfamiliar. There's a section A and a section B. There's a question and answer booklet, short answer and extended answer questions with one worth 10 marks. And we'll talk a little bit more about section A and section B in terms of stimulus material, but section B, as we know, will have at least 2 scenario-based short answer and extended answer questions, and we know that the scenario-based material, the stimulus material, must be used in the answers to the questions, and they could be actual, hypothetical, or a combination of both. In terms of which actual or hypothetical, Unit 3 says it could be actual or hypothetical, and Unit 4 says it's actual. So when you have a look at the exam, what you'll find is actual scenarios are linked to the Unit 4 questions, and then actual and or hypothetical are linked to the Unit 3 questions. So that's just a note as to which will be used as to which. I don't think we need to say any more about that one, Annie. I think it's pretty straightforward what we can expect to see on the exam.
Yeah, it's pretty. The only little thing that I would, stress to teachers is in that section B, even if it's not actually specifically written in each part of the questions, the students must, it's written at the top of section B that the students must relate their answers to the scenario and the stimulus material. And I think a few people might be still a little bit unclear on that. We shouldn't. It is up there at the top of the section B, but that relates to all of the questions in section B.
Yeah, so it doesn't need to say in this case, in this dispute, for the student to use it. They've got to use it. And there are some good examples from the 2018 and 2019 exam now, and reading that along with the examination report to say they've got to use it. So one example was one role of the media, I think, in law reform. It didn't say in this case or in this dispute, but they had to use it. So that's a good point to emphasise. Going on to the next slide in terms of the adjusted study design. Look, I had a read of the adjusted study design, and I know that there are different views about that, but I think that they made a very good choice as to what they removed. My personal view, this is not a view of anyone else but my own, but I think they made a good decision as to removing those particular key knowledge and skills that they did. I just think it was a clean removal. And whilst there might be views as to how interesting that key knowledge was, ultimately they had to make the cut somewhere, and I think that was a good decision to make. Even though they did remove that key knowledge so it's not directly examinable, those cases can still be used to demonstrate other key knowledge. So, for example, a Section 7 and 24 case, for example, can be used as part of an evaluation of the means of checks and balances on parliamentary lawmaking, but the difference is whether it's specifically examinable. But because of this adjusted study design, there has been adjustment in terms of the Unit 3 and 4 allocation, and this is Annie and I's own personal breakdown. It's not a VCAA written as to how we have broken it down, so please don't take this as an authority view, but this is how we've sort of seen it as a bit of a breakdown of how it's going to be broken down in terms of the exam. There's a caution, however, of a few things. One is some of the material in Unit 4 and Unit 3 is examinable. Some of the key knowledge relates to other key knowledge in Unit 3. So just because something's in Unit 4 doesn't mean it can't be assessed as part of a bigger question of Unit 3. So courts is a typical example which canvasses across Unit 3 and Unit 4, and you can see how they could ask a question about courts that relates to both the criminal and civil justice system and constitution, for example. And as I said, the mark split is based on our assumption, and it can only ever be approximate. So I'm not sure how many times you've tried to make an assessment task trying to break down exactly the number of marks, but it's always going to be an approximate Annie, did you want to add anything onto those two slides?
No, look, I really like that suggestion, that point that you've highlighted, Lisa, about the areas of study, particular key knowledge, overlapping with one another throughout the course. And I think that's a little trick when teachers, start to get a little worried that they might not have enough time, and particularly with remote. We have enough time, and I think that's the absolute beauty of selecting what we teach, that it really does overlap. When, for example, when I'm doing my reform, you can look at the Koori Court, which is fantastic, that links into access and justice. It links to criminal law. You can look at committal proceedings, or you have to. That links to Unit 4 when we do, I'm not doing it this year, but if you wanted to do the Victorian Law Reform Commission. And so I think there's lots of areas where teachers might tend to focus on teaching individual key knowledge and then forgetting that it really does overlap. And a lot of Unit 4, the role of the High Court in acting as a check on the Parliament, it totally overlaps with the reasons for and the effects of statutory interpretation, the roles of the High Court in lawmaking, and then beautifully links into the factors of conservatism and activism and the requirement for standing. So, and again, with the features of the relationship between courts and Parliament and the lawmaking. So I think as teachers, we really need to be aware of that as we go through the course, it's been really cleverly written that as we move towards the end now, we really are overlapping a lot of the knowledge that they've already had, which is great to reinforce the points.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think as you're moving into Unit 4, it's about consolidating the knowledge and bringing the Unit 3 in once they're starting to make those connections. So the other example that I can think of is the class actions and representative proceedings. There's a federal parliamentary inquiry on that one at the moment. So that blends into Unit 4 law reform again as well. So there are just so many connections that can be made. And I've always been a big fan of the committal proceeding for LRC. I know that you're not using that one, Annie, but I think we've been a bit hard done by COVID delaying Parliament in tabling that report. It's been finalised and is with the Attorney General, but I think it's 14 sitting days post of 31 March, but we haven't had many sitting days since March. And I think they're now delaying Parliament now until September. So it looks like that report's not going to be available publicly for a while. But that's another good example of Unit 3 and Unit 4 integrating together.
It's a perfect example, and really I was always planning on using that, and then I thought, the fact that we have to look at a recommended reform, if it hasn't been recommended yet, I was thinking perhaps I might not do that one. So people interested, personally, I'm heading to the Royal Commission into Mental Health, and I'm going to do the tree disputes for the Victorian Law Reform Commission.
Just on the Mental Health Commission, they've got a very good website and they've got witness statements available, which they're uploading weekly. So if anyone was interested in the Mental Health Royal Commission one, that's a good one as well. I know that you're not, I think we've talked about this, you're not doing the Lawyer X Royal Commission, are you?
No, but I'll do it next year.
This is just taken from the adjusted study design and copied in, and you should be, if you haven't read it, well familiar with what they've removed from both the outcome statement and those 4 last dot points, which is really the High Court case, the referendum, the other High Court case, and then the external affairs and international declarations and treaties. They've been cleanly removed. And going on to the next slide in terms of the key knowledge, the key skills, removing those that directly relate to those 4 key knowledge, but noting that key skills that relate to other key knowledge have been kept in. So the one that stands out is analyse the ability of the Australian people to protect or change the Australian Constitution. Some might have assumed that only related to the key knowledge about the referendum that you needed to study, but it doesn't. It can also relate to the means by which the Constitution acts as a check on Parliament in lawmaking, including the double majority requirement. So that's just a little thing to be aware of in your studies, that there is that key knowledge that's left in there. Having a look at the next slide about our comments about which are really the most important documents to look at in light of the adjusted study design. There's not only the adjusted study design, and I think they have removed the current study design, I think, from the VCAA page. I think so, as to avoid confusion, but there is the adjusted study design. There's the frequently asked questions on the actual study design, but there's also a frequently asked questions on the adjusted study design, and I think it's well worth a read on that one, of that document. And then, as you know, there are the examination reports, and we've now got 2 examination reports from the 2018 and 2019 exam. And then we've got the 2 past examinations from this current study design. And then, of course, any other authorised VCAA materials really should be looked at to have a think about exam success and anything else you can pick up from what the VCAA says. Annie, did you want to make a comment on any of those documents or otherwise?
No, I think I'll keep my comment on the practice exam questions a bit later. So thanks, Lisa.
Yeah, no worries. Look, I'll pass on to you, Annie, now about the tips. Annie's going to start working through our own personal tips on exam success, and I'll pass over.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. Look, most of these managing time tips, hopefully people will already know, so I'll go through them relatively quickly if I can. But, just the things that we do know, managing the time. It's an 80-mark exam. It's 2 hours, 120 minutes, which gives 15 minutes of reading time. And I just want to start before mentioning anything else about individually answering questions and allocating time. I think that one of the things, Lisa and I were chatting about this the other day, is that when we say to students you need to practice your reading time and use the reading time well, I often think that students, many of mine, they just don't know what that means. They think that using the reading time well is to sit there, read the paper, and then think, oh, it's good, it's bad, and look out the window and worry for 10 minutes. So we really, we've got a slide there saying that there is a way that the students can actually read, use their 15 minutes reading time valuably. Scan the paper, of course, we all do that when we get it, but then sit down and read the paper and carefully look at each question when you read it. They need to look at the task word and they need to look at the mark allocation. So in their head, they can think, well, roughly it's 1.5 minutes per mark. So if it's a 2-mark question, they can, it's 3 minutes that I need to spend on that. If it's a 10-mark question, I'm looking at 15 minutes and 1.5 minutes per mark. If they can get some quicker 2-mark questions done, they might be able to save a little bit of time up their sleeve and spend a little bit more. But they need to look at that and really look at what the questions are asking. And I know every year in that examiner's report, the assessor's report, the assessor always points out to, if it's a simple task word like describe or a simple task word like outline, and it's worth 2 marks, the students don't need to discuss and evaluate and write a book on it. It's often those easy 2-mark, 3-mark questions that are identify, basic, describe, that the students feel comfortable, they know the knowledge, but they literally, fill the box and turn to the end of the extra space at the end, and it's just wasting their time.
And I think it also risks them writing something wrong. So I think they just need to just answer the question and then move on. And I think I totally agree with you. I think that there is a tendency for when they write a 2-marker, they will write too much. Look, in some ways, students need to start to feel comfortable in the exam. I mean, exam conditions are really hard, they're tricky, and these are 17 and 18-year-old students, some of them possibly in year 11. And so some of them might need to adopt a strategy where they need to write and start to get the flow and then move on to the next question, but they just can't get into the danger of writing too much for every of those little questions, because then they will just run out of time. And they will risk writing something too wrong. So I think it's a good point to emphasise.
And I love what you're saying there, that they do need to settle in. And a lot of my students ask me, will we just start with question 1 and work our way right through section A and B? And, for some students that might work, but I love the slide, the little box there that says, group the questions up. I know how to answer this. And I always tell my students, start with what you know. It'll build your confidence, and as you get going, once you settle in, your knowledge will come to you and you'll be better. So I love that, group the questions into, I know the answer to the question, fairly sure I know, oh, this one's a little bit of a worry, leave that perhaps until last or later in the paper, because it's in the back of your mind, and I think they warm up to questions where they feel they might not know it in reading time, but then when they get into the swing of the paper, they a bit more familiar and it comes back to them.
Yeah, and I think you've made another good point, Annie, about it's the student. Not every process will work for every single student the same. So some might feel like they need to methodically work through 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, and then 2A, whatever it is. But others, I think, will be better. They need to settle in. They need to gain their confidence by writing the answers to the questions that they're really comfortable with, and then they'll start to go, oh, now I know the answer to that question. Oh, I've read that stimulus material, and now I know that them talking about Bob and Ada in relation to this is the answer to this question, for example. So I think it's just using different techniques to work out what works for the student, and not just reading the paper for 3 minutes and then staring out the window for the other 12. I think that's the strategy that we need to sort of adopt, of going, how are you going to maximise that 15 minutes? Because that 15 minutes is a long time at the end of the day.
And they do need to, it seems silly, but the last box, go back and read, scan the paper, read it again, work out which questions you know, which ones are familiar, and then that last one, go back and read the questions and really consider the task word and consider the information that's been given to you in the stimulus material, particularly for question section B, and how they're going to work that in usefully into their answer. Some of my students will just look at the stimulus material and just say, as mentioned in source 1, and there's no real connection to the actual answer. It doesn't enhance the answer. They're just paying lip service to a piece of information and really just rewriting it. So they've got to really think to incorporate what points are being made there and make it a meaningful reference, rather than perhaps paying a bit of lip service to it. I just want to spend a little bit of time on this, and I know Liz might have something to add here, but when I'm doing my revision, I did this. I've done this for the last couple of years, and I think it was really worthwhile. I actually spent 3 to 4 lessons, and at our school we have hour lessons, and not all in a row, but throughout my revision, couple of weeks revision, we've got, I hopefully have a little bit more time perhaps up our sleeve, who knows, at the end of the year, maybe not. But it was really useful to actually put a clock on the board on the internet, use the PowerPoint, put up a question, and actually in class time get the students to answer the question within the given time. So our little example there, discuss the ability of imprisonment to deter and protect. They don't see it, and you just put it up, and straight away the clock goes up for 9 minutes because it's a 6-mark question, and they're on the way. And then when they've finished that, to actually then on your next PowerPoint perhaps have an answer, and go through it, discuss what does it mean. Did you look at strengths and weaknesses, pros and cons? And this question specifically relates to deter and protect. So you don't need to talk about punish and rehabilitation, and to go through that with the students, I think, is a really useful thing to do, because I know that a lot of my students, when they come to doing their practice exams, they think that doing revision is to get practice exams and to sit down and do one for 2 hours and do as many as they can. And I actually say to them, that might be valuable to do a few practice exams for 2 hours at the very end of your revision. But then when they start a few weeks out revising, they should be looking at individual questions and timing themselves on the question, then looking at the sample answer, looking at their response and going back and thinking about it, rather than just 2 hours of writing, hand it up to the teacher, you mark this and I'll do another one. So, I think that's a really valuable way to get to use some of that revision time. Just with regard onto that, when I did those questions, I particularly focused on scenario-based and stimulus material questions, because the students do have trouble sometimes linking that into their response. And I have to tell people, if you haven't already seen it, Lisa did a brilliant, it was in the first edition of Compact this year for the VCTA in March, still on the website. So if you haven't seen it, Lisa did a brilliant resource on how to answer a structured question. And if you haven't used that yet, grab that for your revision, because it literally, Lisa's listed down the steps of read the material, read the question, colour up the stimulus material, circle relevant pieces of the information, start formulating your answers, and given some really wise tips about the context of the information, what's relevant and what's just background information. So, and that also, I do know it did come with a great example, and it actually has a worked example. And I think on the Oxford website we've even got 4 annotated questions, one for each area of study, which you could use those questions and then put up the annotated answer for them. But I think that's a really great resource to have a look at and try to use.
I think the only other thing to say about, I know we've got to go on to tip 2, the only other thing to say about the stimulus material is I think from the examination report from 2018 and 2019, the section B mean has been slightly higher than the section A mean. So I think it's about sort of saying to your students, don't be scared of the stimulus material. It actually is, it's a really valuable opportunity to show how you can apply your understanding to a novel case or a novel scenario. So in fact, you can do it and the students can do it. It's just about practicing those skills. And that resource, it's not intended that those students do those steps every time, but what it's intended to be is going, do it first, and then you'll start to just organically do it as you're going along. It's a bit like the synthesis skill. We were trying to sort of emphasise the students are already doing the synthesis. It's just formalising the fact that they are synthesising as part of the study design.
Yes, exactly right. Yeah. So yeah, and I think the more practice you do, the more the students start to think, actually, this stimulus material is providing me with information that I can use. So it's meant to help them, isn't it? So really wise. The next few are just quick tips. I know people will know, but just in case people didn't realise, generally speaking, there's about 4 lines per mark left allocated for the VCAR exams. There's that 10-mark question at the end. That's got a little more. That's got the 2 full pages of lines. And remember, it's 10 marks. If we're equally allocating our time, it's 15 minutes. So, two pages is quite a lot there. And, of course, there's some extra space at the end. Remember, they're just an estimate, the lines, but it can give the students a bit of an indication of how much they might be wanting to write there. But the very best thing to look at when they're thinking of how long the response should be, of course, is the task word that they're required to do and the mark allocation. So that's really the thing, and the knowledge that's being assessed. So just a couple of other things. Oh, this is one of the bugbears of my life, students writing in paragraphs, and I know the people that assess will be sitting in their chairs at home going, yes, but look, isn't there nothing worse than getting an 8-mark question and it just being one slab of writing where they're not using paragraphs and making sure that they're putting 1 or 2 key points per paragraph and then moving on. That's really, we need to practice that. And last year, for the first time, I gave my students two different times. I just randomly got an answer to a 10-mark question, scanned it up, did it online. They had to upload it, and I said to them, I want you to put where the paragraphs are. And the question that I used had literally the paragraph started with, and another reason why committal hearings are, and then the next one would be another strength of, but you know what, they found it really hard to do that. And so I think that's a worthwhile little, one lesson just to get them to look at things. Where would you put the paragraph? And even for, some of those 5 and 6 mark questions, they can still be writing in paragraphs, of course the short ones, but when they're doing those 7, 8 and 10 mark questions, that's just something that makes them think about the structure of their answer and actually helps them address the question that's being asked. So I think that's really vital.
It also helps them understand when they've actually answered the question, when they've gotten to the end of the answer. So, if they're properly paragraphed and signposted, they can sort of skim it back when they're finished and gone, well, have I actually addressed this part of the question? Where is that answer? So it helps them as well.
And just with answering the questions, it's really important. I think we're going to get to this in a moment, but it's really important that students, yes, they have to learn their knowledge, but to rote learn answers and knowledge and feel with this newer study design we've had now, that's got a really high emphasis on application, to feel that they can rote learn a question and pop in an answer that doesn't relate, it's really doing them a disservice. For questions asking the students to discuss the extent to which the doctrine of precedent can assist the courts in lawmaking, their answer should not start, one strength of the doctrine of precedent is, another strength is. The question is saying, to what extent can it assist the courts in their ability to make law? They need to, they don't want to write it emphasising strengths and weaknesses. Although they'll incorporate those, I think that we really do need to address the questions being asked and incorporate and apply their knowledge rather than the old sort of rote learning. Of course, no dot points and no tables and charts. They need to write in legible, coherent paragraphs. I think we've done a little bit on this here, but just reading and responding to the question, there is a little on our Oxford website for the OBOOK again. There's a great little video. I've forgotten who does it now, but there's a great little video that's tells students how to look at answering exam questions and structuring the question for an exam. So that's a useful one, especially now we're on remote. You might want to have a look at some of those videos and focus on, addressing the task word, in this case, addressing that it's only one purpose, not 3 or 4 purposes, and having a look at the mark allocation. So there are some activities that we can do with that, and there's some great ones on the OBOOK that people can use to really give practice at reading and responding to the questions. Tip number 3 again. Of course, a few people do say, where do we find out what these actual key terms mean? That's right at the very start of the book, and actually the start of our book and next year's as well does actually have a section on preparation and exam tips. So we think we might forget about that when we get to the end of the book at the end of the year. Head back to the start and look at some of that information that's there. There's some really good information there.
Yeah, chapter one's great with providing these. I mean, look, these are not official task words because, as we know, VCEE doesn't formalise what each task word or command word means, but we've just adopted this from what's been in the exams in the past. And we've updated it, as you can see on this slide, to include those very specific questions of what, who and why, because they're the direct questions rather than the task words. We seem to sort of go down the path of going, it's going to be a describe or an explain and evaluate, but there are being specific question mark questions, question marks at the end, and so we've updated that. But also chapter 1, what we've updated as well is provided a bit of an explanation to students about how a particular key knowledge or content can be assessed in both a low, medium and high order skill. So I think we've used an example of the principles of justice, so saying describe one of the principles of justice, or then it might be, describe whether the principle of justice of X is achieved, or discuss the extent to which. So looking at a particular key knowledge and scaffolding the learning, so it's going from the low order task words to the high order task words. So it's, as Annie said, it's worth going back to chapter 1 once you get to the official exam revision portion of your studies.
Very much. Thanks, Liz. And just while we're on that, just a word of caution, I think it's worthwhile saying, it's just reminded me as we were talking about task words, is there are a lot of commercially produced practice exams and resources available now. And I think it is worth Lisa just mentioned there that, they are not, VCAR has not put out a list of the key task words, and a lot of the commercially produced, or all of the commercially produced resources, they're not VCAR endorsed. They're just people who are producing these SACs and practice SACs and practice exams. But it really is up to us teachers to not just buy one and say, well, this is great, I'm going to give it to the students and the solution is good, and it's good in terms of content and questions that are directed towards that have appropriate mark allocations and marking schemes. So I think that just as a word of caution there, we really need to have a look at something before we distribute it and just have a check. I have noticed over this year and last year that, some of the commercially written exams might have a discussed question worth 3 marks.
Yeah.
That's not in keeping with what we would see in the VCAR exams. So, when you're deciding what resources to use and what to subscribe to, have a little look at the mark allocation. And sometimes questions are asked on things that they're obscure. They wouldn't be questions that we get. We're not going to get a describe or an outline question worth 5 marks. And I actually saw a 10-mark question in one that was an explain question. Now, explain is just, it's not going to be a 10-mark question on the end of your paper. The end of your that will be to what extent and analyse and to discuss and apply knowledge. So it is just an interesting one that, if we need to know, we can ring publishers and we can ring these providers and say who actually wrote it, because there's some wonderful teachers out there writing brilliant stuff. So I think that's worthwhile doing as well.
Yeah, I think the vetting process is important. I think you make a good point there.
Yeah, and pretty quick one. So I'll go pretty quickly through these. We've done the rote learn and the pre-prepared. Reference to the source material we've mentioned. I love that one. That's in the assessor's report. It's been clearly written for the last 2 years. The students are not required to define key terms and concepts at the start of their answer and then launch into an answer. So they might have a question related to, which would be more appropriate in this case for the parties to have their dispute resolved by Consumer Affairs Victoria or Victorian Civil Administrative Tribunal. And some students will start by saying, the VCAT is and they'll give a big definition of the role of VCAT, and it's lovely and it's rote learn and it's perfect, but actually it's not what the question's asking. So it's very clear in the assessor's report, students are not required to define the key terms and concepts unless the question actually specifically requires it.
And the reality is that they will define it in their question answer anyway. So when they're talking about the appropriateness of, for example, plea negotiations or sentence indications or whatever, they have to actually know what the concept is to be able to get the full marks anyway. So you will see in the students in their assessment tasks, they're going to know it by answering it. So they're going to, when they talk about plea negotiations, for example, of appropriateness, you'll start to see the formulation of a discussion that it's about negotiating a deal or it's about bargaining with the prosecutor as to whether they're going to plead guilty. And so they're defining it within their answer, so not defining it at the start and then going through the answer. There's no point to doing it.
That's exactly right. And the one that comes to mind for me is the ability of the double majority to act as a check on Parliament. And so they don't need to define it. They're going to define it when they say it's got to be passed by the people to prevent the Parliament from making changes to enhance their own benefit or, to increase their own lawmaking powers or whatever. So I think that's a really useful one because it's a bit of a time waster under exam pressure. And the same thing, don't describe the methods institutions. We've done that. And abbreviations are okay. That's clearly been in the assessors' reports as well. As long as the student writes the term in full at the start, puts the abbreviation in brackets and then continues. So I think even with one of the questions on last year's exam, I can't think of the name off the head, but someone had quite a long name.
Mr. Diorder.
Yes, that was the case. And they could have written it once and put Mr. D.O. in brackets and, the answer's there. So, I think that's a really worthwhile thing. But the problem with that is so many students will use the abbreviation without actually writing what the term is in full in the first place. And then some of my students will then, they will abbreviate things that they just shouldn't abbreviate. Don't abbreviate government to gov. I say you've got enough time to write government or parliament to parl. Things like that. A little bit of common sense, and we probably should be looking out for that. The recent, I'm not sure that we need to go into that too much, so look, the slide's there to have a read of, but of course the study design does say, and we might actually even go on to the next slide, we'll better leave that one up for a while, but the study design does say that in certain areas that we've got to have recent. So we know that recent is mentioned in Unit 3 in regard to the reforms to the criminal and civil justice system, and we know that it's in Unit 4 in regard to the Law Reform Commission example and in regard to either a parliamentary committee example, or alternatively you will be looking at royal commissions and you need an example of a recommendation for that. So the 4 years is the cut-off for those reforms, and it's 4 years to the current year that we're in at the moment.
And there could be a recommendation in an interim report. So the Mental Health Royal Commission, for example, released an interim report and they had 9 recommendations in its interim report, and then they will release their final recommendations. It would have been end of this year, but they've got an extension to February next year. So it doesn't need to be in its final report. It just needs to be a recommendation.
That's what, yeah, which already mean. And I think the next edition of Compact coming out will have a resource on the Royal Commission into mental health. So, and it's got some of the recommendations from that interim report mentioned. So if people are thinking they might be changing, there are a few, people, I've been receiving a few emails about the recent. Personally, if people are interested, I'm not going to do the the Victorian Law Reform Commission investigation into medicinal cannabis. We know that if there has been discussion in the media within the last 4 years that makes the reform appropriate. But I think there are so many, we've had enough other Victorian Law Reform Commission investigations now. I think we can go with one. And likewise, last year I did the Royal Commission into the youth detention in the Northern Territory, and we've had so many since then that I'd just rather my students had something a little bit more current than sort of debating the 2016 ones. For that one, and that takes us through, I've talked about that one, so on to the next slide, which leaves us a little bit of time for some questions and answers.
I think I might have popped this in, so Annie, I'm happy to mention this, or I'm happy for you to go with it. I think it was just making a point that where they're asked to choose cases or examples or use stimulus material, to make their choices wisely, sort of go with the obvious. So reading the stimulus material carefully and going with that which has the richest source material, and using cases examples in a way that they enhance the answer. I think sometimes there might be a tendency to say to students, just pop in an example or a case whenever in every answer, but sometimes questions just don't lend themselves to cases or examples, and so really in a way the case is used but it's not used in any sort of meaningful form, or it's not enhancing the answer at all. So I think it's just making choices appropriately in terms of when to use things. And also perhaps maybe there needs to be a real emphasis on, if they're asked to make an election, or do you think that this body or this body is appropriate, or would you advise to do this or this, to make the choice. Don't sit on the fence, make the decision as to which one's appropriate. And then the last one is, there is that one choice in that Unit 4 area study too, making sure that they remember which one is which that they've actually studied is important, because I think sometimes students might get a bit flustered and confused as to which one they actually studied.
Oh yes, we've had that before. I've had a girl come out and say, I did such and such, and I said, we didn't look at that. So, I did it as an example in class and might have talked about it, but actually we studied that Royal Commission. So never mind, it does happen. A very, very good tip.
I think, is that the end of our tips, or is that, we got more?
I think that, for me, that's the end of the tips. So perhaps Kate might be having a look. I think we might have quite a few questions, but we'll try to get through as many as we can.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm back. So I've collated a few questions. The chat has been very active and keeping me busy. So we'll get through a few, maybe 5 or so, just because I am mindful that we want to have some healthy, robust discussion around these questions, and but we also don't want to keep people too long. So there's a few questions. The first few questions were in regards to those command or task words that we were talking about earlier. So firstly, Anonymous asked, in a discussion or evaluation question, is it mandatory to include a conclusion, especially in an evaluation question where there is an option? This seems to be duplication.
So I think the examination reports have been really clear on this one, and I think it's worth going back to the 2018 and 2019 ones on this one about discussion not requiring any formal conclusion because it's not an evaluation, it's not asking them to form an opinion or provide a judgment. Evaluation does. So I think there is a distinction between discussion and evaluation. In terms of an opinion, so if a question asks for an opinion, obviously the opinion needs to be provided. And so, discuss the extent to which you agree with this statement is a typical example of where the opinion needs to be there. So I think it's worth, without having the exam reports in front of me, very much worth going back to the 2018 and 2019 ones, because there's been some quite specific advice on those ones.
Yes, I totally agree. I think some people have sort of gotten the habit of saying, well, if it's an evaluate and discuss question, they must at the end conclude. And so there has been some really clear advice in those papers saying if they are asked their opinion, then definitely they would want to do some overall weighting. But I think we've had more clarity on it now that, given if you look at the wording of the question, there might be a period where you have discussed it and you've looked at it and you don't need to make that overall judgment at the end.
Awesome. All right. So the second question, again, about the command or task words. In a discuss the extent question, do students need to specifically address the extent, e.g. moderate, significant, etc., or is it sufficient that this becomes evident in their discussion?
I think they need to address it and preferably at the start.
Yep, absolutely. I always get mine and the words that have been used in that question. I strongly agree. I somewhat agree. I largely agree. Because they say it. I actually, even if a question says, and I'll be interested in Lisa's opinion on this, but, if a question says, do you agree? It has a statement, do you agree with this statement? I tell my students to start with saying, I agree with statement, actually,
Absolutely.
because a mark will be allocated for answering the question.
Great. Excellent. Okay, so there's a few questions now about the exam specifically, and you two touched on this earlier regards to, Section A and Section B. So Grant asked, what do you think about the strategy of doing Section B first because you have to read the stimulus material, then do the 10 marks with strict time allocation, and then do the rest of Section A before coming back to the 10 marker to finish it off? Was that clear?
It's clear. Annie, did you want to have a go at this? And then,
well, it's interesting. I know exactly what you've asked, Grant, because I will have a couple of students ask this every time. They're thinking, and look, it's an individual choice really when it comes down to it. But some of the students say to me, look, I've read the paper. There is quite a lot of stimulus material in Section B, and so by the time I've read that, it's fresh in my mind, and I would rather attack Section B first while that's fresh in my mind and I've just read it in reading time and write my answers to it. So I have had some quite good students that go in with a plan that they will actually address Section B first. But I always say to my students, personally, my advice would be to start with the questions that you know, because it will build your confidence. You can get them out of the way relatively quickly. And, if you've gone in with a pre-prepared plan to answer question 1 of Section B first, and it's not overly worded the way that you might have been expecting and you're a little bit tentative, that's not a productive way to get yourself into the swing of the exam.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is highly dependent on the student. Not all 10,000 students will be able to tackle the exam in the same way.
Wonderful. Thank you both. So again, talking about both sections of the paper, Michael asked, as the paper last year had an unprecedented amount of reading both in Section A and B, what do you think is the best way for students to deal with the amount that might be required to read? It can be intimidating.
Well, that's an interesting question, but look, I know people have done an analysis and had a look, and there certainly was more stimulus material. From discussions I've had, though, it does seem like that in the business studies subjects anyway, that the new study designs do have more of an emphasis on apply and application and synthesis, and so there will be more stimulus material for them to read. And so I think more than not really a question about how they'll attack it in the paper, use that reading time. Of course, they have to read it and they have to just go slowly through and work their way. But I think this is something that we really need to address when we're teaching throughout the year. And I know this year, every single one of my practice SACs and my SAC tests now, I'm incorporating far more stimulus material and far more scenario-based questions than I did when I first started in 2018 to this course. So if teachers haven't, teachers are still asking a lot of straightforward questions without stimulus material and scenarios, I would say to them, for the rest of the year, try to incorporate more practice at that, and definitely in the revision, do more practice at the questions, because we know it's there, and Section A had a lot of stimulus material as well. So I just think that's a skill that we really need to expose them to as much as possible.
Yeah, I think it's practice, and I know we've got to move on, but just a very quick one. If you're giving them lots of stimulus material, just make sure the question requires them to use that stimulus material rather than it actually being a standalone question just tacked onto the stimulus material. So I know, Kate, we're running out of time, so...
Great, thank you. Just a couple quick questions. What is your position on using first person in a response? So I think...
Fine.
Yep, great. On the topic of abbreviations, do students need to write the full term in every answer, which covers lots of area of study? So, for instance, they can define the abbreviation in question 1, for example, and then use that abbreviation throughout the whole paper? Or do they need to define it in every question?
I do it in every response.
In every response.
Yep, and I do it I say, to be sure, do it in every response.
Better safe than sorry.
Yeah.
And in the current text with the adjusted study design, what are your thoughts on leaving out Chapter 11 entirely? So that would be changing and protecting the Constitution.
Annie, do you want to answer that one?
That's interesting, because I didn't. I've taught the course, but I have taught things like the High Court. I have used examples from it. So I did dabble into I didn't write off Chapter 11. I actually used it. And, because I'm still saying to my students, you might not need an example of a referendum, for example, like we did. But if it comes up, I did do an example so they knew a little. I did an example of the High Court for the division of lawmaking powers. I did an example. I did a little bit on the Roach case and ACT versus the Commonwealth to explain the role of the High Court. So I dabbled in and out of it. So I didn't discount the whole chapter.
Great, thank you. And just finally, we had quite a few people ask, Annie, when you were talking about those great resources for time and mark allocation. So you mentioned the compact resource from Lisa,
yes.
And I believe the annotated samples from our OBOOK.
Yes.
For justice and outcomes. So where can people find that compact resource?
So if they're members of the VCTA, which hopefully most of us are, or the school will have a membership, hopefully, do check. If you don't know, ask your head of faculty, because it covers all of the business subjects. And so Lisa's, when you go into that, on the compact site there, Lisa's was in March 2020. It's this year. So they're all available on the website, and if you jumped on the website, you'd see that one.
Wonderful. And with regards to the annotated samples there on Oxford Digital through the OBOOK Assess for Justice and Outcomes, which if you're an Oxford user, you should hopefully be familiar with OBOOK Assess. So you can find them on your Teacher Resources tab.
Yeah.
So that takes us to the end of the questions, which is great. I think we got to everyone. Okay. And I am mindful that we are at time with 5 o'clock and we don't want to keep you waiting. But if you have got an extra 10 minutes, my disembodied voice is just going to take you through some of the key changes that we have made to the upcoming editions of Legal Studies for VCE. There were a few questions in the chat as we were talking, Lisa and Annie, about the changes that we've made, the recent or recommended reforms that we'll be, looking at in the next editions. And so I thought it'd be a great chance to talk about that now as well. So, You are looking at our beautiful new covers for the 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 books, as well as some product and pricing information. I thought we'd start with the boring stuff before we get into the exciting, fun content stuff. So you can see here that the book is priced around $74.95 each. That includes access to a range of digital resources on OBook Assess for the student. If your whole class purchases the book, there is a complimentary subscription for the teacher to the Teacher OBook Assess, on which you have access to detailed teacher notes for each topic, answers for every question in the book, video tutorials delivered by our expert authors, and a range of other wonderful, expertly crafted resources such as worksheets, videos, web links, practice sacks, to help your students achieve in legal studies for VCE. So I thought I'd just touch on what we have coming out in this new edition that's new. And while we're on the topic of digital content on OBook Assess, I'm excited to talk about some of the exciting new digital features we have. So on the left there, you can see a little app screen, and this is our very own Justice and Outcomes content hosted through Quizlet. So Quizlet might be something that you're already using in your own classroom. I know, Annie, you use it with your students and they love it. So Quizlet is a website or an app that is a great tool for revision and study for students. There are a range of different ways that students can revise on Quizlet, but probably the best and most exciting way is with a little bit of healthy competition where the teacher can create a Quizlet live game and students sort of battle in teams to prove their knowledge and get to the end first. And I know, Annie, again, you said that your girls have gotten very competitive. Playing games of Quizlet Live. So we're very excited to, for the first time ever, be able to host this amazing top quality Oxford content, but through sort of a different digital avenue. Your students can play it anytime, anywhere. I know that no one's really going anywhere at the moment, but they could be playing it on the bus on the way to and from school, or in class on their device. The other thing we have on the right-hand side of the screen there is a mark book. So for the first time ever, you will be able to track your students' progress through the book. For each topic within each chapter, there is going to be a linked quiz that the first attempt of your students' results will feed through to the mark book, of which there's an example on the screen now. And you can also add your own custom assessments into there. So the idea is that this would give you a holistic view of how your students are tracking through the progress of the course and through the book. So I think, it's important when any new book comes out to know what's new and what's old. So Lisa and Annie touched on this in their presentation that, we do need to use more scenario-based questions and more stimulus-based material. So over 80% of the scenarios throughout both books have been updated to be more new, recent and relevant cases. We have also updated the review spreads at the end of each chapter. So they now include 3 top tips from that chapter from our wonderful authors, as well as 3 graded exam-style questions and a practice assessment task. We've also paired it back to try and sort of make the books a bit more laser-focused, delivering complex and potentially confusing content for students in easy-to-read formats like tables or diagrams. We've moved the going further sections that we had in our previous editions that were great and were great for extending students but didn't tie directly to the syllabus. We've moved them onto the OBook so that we can enhance the focus of the physical book. And we've also updated the terminology throughout to simplify the structure of the book and encourage students to get familiar with syllabus terminology. So if you're using us currently or have used this in the past, you know that there was an in the news section, a case study section, a legal case section, extracts, etc. Now we just have actual scenarios and hypothetical scenarios. So it is reflective of the syllabus terminology. As well as that, we've kept the best features of the previous edition. So we still have the standalone toolkit chapter at the beginning that Lisa and Annie mentioned earlier, which provides really great course information, some exam advice and preparation, some tips. We have an introductory chapter at the beginning of each unit that helps cover key concepts. Each chapter opener spread has the clear outcomes, key knowledge and key terms from the study design. And then in each chapter, we still have margin notes throughout, including study tips written by our 3 expert authors and a few exciting did you know tidbits spread around. At the end of every topic, there's still a range of leveled questions that support differentiation and can, are accessible for any kid at any point of learning. And last but certainly not least, we have Lisa and Annie and Peter Farah, who is not on the call today, but is on a call. We're running another webinar on Thursday, which he will be a part of. So we have Lisa, Peter and Annie back to bring their expert knowledge and experience to the book, which is one of the best features. So I'm going to hand it back to Lisa to talk you through the changes that we've made in terms of the recent recommended reforms and recent legal cases. So over to you, Lisa.
That was a perfect timing because my 6-week-old was just screaming in the background ready for a feed, and I've just managed to have the 30 seconds to be able to start feeding him, so thank you for that. So this is, we tried to think really carefully about which case studies we would keep and which ones we would replace with fresher ones. So don't be alarmed. All of the really great High Court ones, all of the, landmark cases are all kept in there. We've kept Marbo in Access and Justice. We've kept all of the Franklin Dam and the Brisbane cases. So, but we've refreshed the ones that really sort of were from sort of 2016, 2017 with sort of newer ones. We have, for Unit 2, Area Study 1, the 4 recent criminal cases. Peter's done a great job with pulling together these four cases. One was the Airbnb murder of the very young girl who was studying at uni, so a bit of a sort of a youth justice, a youth offender. We also covered the Rostevsky case, which we think was a really fascinating case from the perspective of what the offender's conduct, and in particular the trial. We did the Haberfield case, which was really the emergency workers assault case, which was really interesting from an appeal perspective. And then we've also looked at the acquittal of Cardinal George Pell in the 4th recent criminal case. The civil cases, we've done 5, we've kept 1. We've kept the Rebel Wilson case and we've put it onto the digital because that's still going to be recent up until 2022 because the appeal was in 2018. So we thought, look, it's, the students really love the Rebel Wilson case. We didn't want to get rid of it completely, but it's on the digital. But the 4 that are included in the actual book, one was where a crime reporter sued the Age for vicarious trauma for having to report on crimes. We have covered the current ongoing Uber taxi class action. We've had a look at a VCAT case, which is a little bit different, of a fire in Docklands, and thanks to Annie for putting me onto that. It was a really interesting case. And then we've also then dealt with one of a Lawyer X civil case where Farouk Ulman is now, it's reported that he's suing the state of Victoria, and he was the one who recently was acquitted after seeking a appeal of mercy because of what it was revealed of Nicola Gobbo passing on about his case to the police as an informant. So the Victorian criminal justice system, the recent changes that we've looked at is the expansion of the Koori Court into 2 regional areas. So that will take us through to 2023. We've touched on the victim support dog program, something a little bit different. So the use of support dogs for vulnerable witnesses in the criminal justice system. And we've looked at some changes to committal proceedings that occurred in 2018, but then were updated in 2020. We've recommended the recommended reforms of the continued expansion of the Koori Court. Judge-alone trials, which I think is really topical at the moment, particularly given the recent introduction of the temporary measures in this space. So I think that's a good one to look at. And then increased funding for legal aid, legal centres and other services, which I think is a continued recommended reform, but still a valuable one. From a civil perspective, we've looked at the group class orders legislation that came into effect just a couple of months ago, technological changes and expansion of VCAT's fast-track mediation, which used to be called the short mediation and hearing. So again, we've used ones from 2019 and 20, so it takes you through a few years. And then recommended contingency fee agreements, which links into class actions more, use of case management, and a national justice interpreter scheme, which was one of the recommendations of the Law Council of Australia a couple of years ago. And then Annie, you did these ones in Unit 4 area study too. Did you want to talk briefly on those ones?
Yes. Of course, we do the improvements to the committal system, because it's so good to use case studies and examples throughout the text that you can use in so many different areas of study of the course. So it links beautifully to Unit 4, 3 and the criminal justice system and Unit 4. So looked at the improvements to the committal system. For the parliamentary committee, we had a look at the purposes of the drug testing parliamentary committee there, and that we linking nicely into, if in Year 11, if they were looking at the case involving the lawyer X, this one takes it right through and did a focus on that. But I just want to add, there are so many other case studies throughout the book. These are just the main ones that we've highlighted. And so we've mentioned lots of other royal commissions and parliamentary committees. And I think that is a strength of when people are making decisions about their resources. You need to have cases that overlap, that can move and illustrate various key knowledge of the course. And so I think that's really important. And if people are interested, I know that they can get a sample on the website. They can download a sample of Chapter 15 for this year. So as we're heading to teaching the law reform section, which is the last section of Area Study 2 in Unit 4, people can download that, have a look at it, and you've got all the new up-to-date resources there for you if you're thinking of that in terms of your teaching for this year.
I think the only other thing I'll mention, sorry Kay, I know we're out of time, but what we tried to do with the recent and recommended forms, I know that teachers were feeling really overwhelmed with how many we had in there in the last edition, so we have simplified it to just having those 3 recent, 3 recommended, and going into detail with each of them, and also addressing the principles of justice quite specifically for each. So we've just made that choice. We know you only have to do, recent reforms, so probably 2, but we've added in 3 of each, and of recent and recommended.
Excellent. Great. Thank you both so much for talking us through that. We are just 15 minutes over time, so thank you all. Thank you so much to all of you who stuck with us. Just as Annie mentioned, there is some sample content now available for these forthcoming editions. So you can visit that link there, oup.com.au/VCE-legal. You can view the sample pages, and by the end of this week, the digital samples will also be live. So there will be a sample chapter of the OBOOK Assess where you can go around, click in, see what the Quizlet integration looks like, see what the markbook looks like. We have populated it with some pretend student data so that you could actually get a good picture of what it would be like to have your own students loaded in there and click around and have a play. So that will all be live by the end of the week. And as always, if you'd like access to any of these samples, also please get in touch with your local Oxford sales consultant. And if you have any questions about what you've seen here today, about VCE Legal, or about any Oxford product at all, please follow that link. Or if you know who your local Oxford consultant is, get in touch with them. Here they are now. They are always here to help, and especially during these wild times. We'd love to hear from you and do as much as we can to make your life a little bit easier. Thank you so much for making the effort to join us today. We really appreciate it, especially with everything that's going on. And we feel very grateful that you've taken the time to come and spend your Monday afternoon with us. And please don't hesitate to get in touch if you had any questions about anything you've seen here today. Thank you so much again, and stay safe and well and happy, everybody. Thank you.